Two disappearances, yet one shadow connects them. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axen. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. Your messages always brighten these mysteries. Now, let's dive in. There were few things in Flaxborough more reliable than its allotment holders, who could be expected to appear at their plots in every season except a direct blizzard, and even then only after giving the matter some consideration. Each gardener had his or her own rhythms, early risers who frightened the sparrows, late comers who cultivated vegetables under moonlight as though playing at intrigue, and of course the handful of old souls who turned up more often for the gossip than the marrows. On a mild Thursday morning in late April, Flaxborough's idea of spring, several of these worthies were gathered at the communal water tap. The tap, being the only reliable source of running water on the site, was an unintentional social hub. It was here that Mr. Cyril Wassiter, a wiry man with a suspicious nature and a moustache evidently modelled on something he had once admired in a shop window, declared in a trembling voice that something was most decidedly not right. He had just discovered that the shed belonging to the late Mrs. Mildred Trotspole, recently deceased, God rest her peppermints, was entirely empty, not merely tidied, not merely cleared by a conscientious relative. Empty. Nothing left, swept bare, he insisted, addressing the cluster of gardeners with the wild-eyed urgency of a prophet whose congregation was never quite up to prophecy. Her tools, pots, seed trays, the wheelbarrow with the dent from last year's hose-pipe tangle. All gone. Maybe her nephew took them, suggested Mrs. Tibbet, whose personal allotment consisted of 2 rows of underachieving cabbages and a garden chair in which she spent more time than any of her vegetables. She sipped tea from a flask so dented that the liquid inside could justifiably be considered vintage. "No nephew," said Mr. Wassiter, lowering his voice. "No living relations at all, and besides, who'd come at night?" "Why assume it was night?" Mrs. Tibbet asked. "Not everything wicked happens after 7 o'clock." "I didn't say wicked. Did I say wicked? But tools don't simply walk." His suspicious mustache twitched, and she had a lantern in there, a brass one from her late husband's days at the railway. Worth a good bit, that. This last remark had the desired effect. Several allotment holders straightened at once, adopting an air of profound concern. A shed burglary, however modest, constituted in Flaxborough terms an event. Not one rivaling a contested bake-off trophy or an unfortunate remark at the Women's Institute AGM, but newsworthy enough. Yet what troubled Mr. Wassiter most, as he went over it again with theatrical despondency, was not the loss of tools. It was the disappearance of the shed itself. For indeed, Mrs. Trotspole's shed, an unlovely wooden thing painted an unpopular shade of municipal green, was nowhere to be found. The patch of earth it once stood upon showed only flattened grass and a few wood chips suggestive of a hasty departure. "Somebody," he said, pausing for effect, "has taken the whole blessed thing. Walls, roof, and all." This, of course, stirred a different quality of alarm among the allotment circle. Tools might go missing, but a shed? That required planning, equipment, motive, 3 qualities rarely found together in Flaxborough unless the council was involved, and even then only accidentally. By noon, the gardeners' collective agitation had crystallized into a decision. The matter must be reported. The police, it was agreed, would know what to do. Inspector Walter Purbright, at that particular hour of the day, was engaged in one of his more delicate responsibilities, proofreading the weekly rota for spelling errors introduced by Sergeant Malley, whose dyslexic creativity with surnames had once resulted in a Constable Times reporting for duty in place of Constable Times, to nobody's satisfaction. The inspector looked up from his papers with the mild, patient interest of a man accustomed to Flaxborough's unique sense of drama. A shed, missing, Purbright repeated politely after hearing Mr. Wassiter's complaint, which had been delivered with the urgency of a small coup d'etat. "Vanished, sir. Removed root and branch. You'll want to take statements, I shouldn't wonder. Photographs, measurements, perhaps even the dogs." "I expect the situation will be manageable without canine involvement," Purbright replied. His tone was gentle, but it carried just enough firmness to steady the nervous allotment holder. "Tell me, was anything else disturbed?" "Just my nerves, Inspector." "I meant on the adjoining plots." "Oh." Wassiter blinked. "Well, yes, actually. Mrs. Skilby's rhubarb looks trampled, but that might have been Mrs. Skilby." Purbright regarded him mildly. Experience had taught him that in Flaxborough many offences began as misunderstandings, escalated into scandals, and eventually returned home as misunderstandings again. Still, a missing shed was unusual. Even eccentric thieves rarely bothered with real estate. "I'll stroll down myself," Purbright said, rising. "A shed is not the sort of thing one ought to mislay." The allotments, as always, smelled faintly of damp earth, decaying compost, and the fierce pride of amateur horticulturalists. Purbright walked the rows unhurriedly, receiving waves from those who had heard the news and eager stares from those who wanted confirmation of it. At the vacant patch, he paused, tilted his head, and studied the ground. Noticing does not always require great effort. Often it is the lack of something that calls loudest for attention. "No sign of drag marks," he murmured. So it was lifted. He said it quietly, not to impress, but simply because he found it curious. A shed could not be removed silently. Yet none of the neighbours claimed to have heard anything in the night. "Inspector," called a voice from 2 plots down. "Have you heard?" It was Mr. Henry Wackles, a man with the perpetually startled expression of someone who has just read the terms and conditions of something he signed last year. "Yes," Purbright answered. "About the shed." "And the other thing?" Purbright turned. "Other thing." Wackles lowered his voice to a fearful whisper. "It's Mrs. Skilby. She's not turned up today, or yesterday, and she always turns up. People do go away unexpectedly," the inspector pointed out. "Not Mrs. Skilby. She waters at dawn. At dawn, Inspector." This detail, delivered with the solemnity of a military tribute, lingered in the air a moment. Purbright filed it away. Not as evidence, merely as something that a quiet corner of his mind might find interesting later. "Well," he said, "if Mrs. Skilby hasn't appeared by evening, you may ring the station. For now, let's not alarm ourselves unnecessarily." Wackles nodded, though his expression suggested that unnecessary alarm was precisely what he specialized in. Purbright walked back toward the station with a calm, measured step. A missing shed and an absent allotment holder were not, on the surface, matters to rouse dramatic conclusions. Yet the inspector, who had spent many years listening to what Flaxborough chose not to say, felt an odd undercurrent in the day's peculiar happenings. A shed stolen whole. A woman silently absent. A community whispering before knowing what to whisper about. Flaxborough, it seemed, was preparing another of its modest but strangely persistent mysteries. Purbright allowed himself a mild sigh. He supposed the paperwork would have to wait. Inspector Purbright returned to the station with the unhurried gait of a man who knew that hurrying seldom improved the quality of thought. The missing shed, curious though it was, had not yet crossed the threshold into urgent matter. Still, something in the quietness of the allotments bothered him, a sense that the usual rhythm of Flaxborough life had faltered, even if no one could yet agree on the cause. He had barely hung his hat when Sergeant Malley appeared at his office door. Malley possessed a talent for entering rooms as though summoned by an invisible bell, though the timing was usually coincidence. "Sir," Malley began, "we've had a call from Mr. Wackles." "Already?" Purbright settled into his chair. "We parted not half an hour ago." "Yes, sir. He says Mrs. Skilby still hasn't turned up." Purbright raised an eyebrow with polite astonishment. "Given the hour, I imagine most of Flaxborough has not turned up." Mally shuffled a paper. "He insists she'd normally have been round the allotments by now. Wanted it noted officially." The inspector paused. Wockless was a man easily rattled, but he was not imaginative. If he believed something was amiss, he would cling to that belief with the grip of a barnacle on a damp pier. "Very well," Purbright said. "Send Constable Harrowby to check whether Mrs. Skilby is at home. A simple welfare visit." Mally nodded and left, closing the door with the gentleness of a man who had once been rebuked for slamming it during a moment of enthusiasm. Purbright turned to the window. The allotments lay a mile or so eastward, and he pictured them in the midday sun. Tidy rows, scattered tools, the gap where a shed ought to stand like a missing tooth in an otherwise serviceable mouth. He did not expect Harrowby's visit to reveal anything dramatic, yet the thought of Mrs. Skilby, an industrious widow known for her rhubarb and her lack of humor, lingered like a quiet obligation. It was still lingering 10 minutes later when Harrowby returned more quickly than seemed promising. The constable appeared in the doorway, looking grave in the way only young policemen can manage, as though the world had personally entrusted its sorrows to him. "Sir," Harrowby said, "nobody's answering the door at Mrs. Skilby's house. Curtains all closed, milk still on the step." Purbright folded his hands. "You knocked properly, I trust?" "Yes, sir." "And you checked with the neighbors?" A hesitation. "Well, no, sir. I came straight back." Purbright nodded. Harrowby possessed the earnestness of a church hymn, but had yet to acquire its lingering depth. "We will try again, Constable." "Come along." They walked the short distance to Rosewater Lane, where Mrs. Skilby lived in a semi-detached cottage that leaned slightly toward its neighbor as though sharing a long, whispered secret. The curtains were indeed drawn, and the 2 bottles of milk stood on the doorstep with an air of abandonment. Purbright knocked. 3 polite taps, firm but not officious. After a pause, he knocked again. The house gave no response. It was Mrs. Barling from next door who eventually emerged, curious as a window curtain. "Oh, Inspector Purbright," she exclaimed, delighted by the unexpected elevation of her morning. "Is something the matter?" "Merely checking on Mrs. Skilby," Purbright replied, "as she was expected elsewhere and did not appear. Have you seen her today?" Mrs. Barling adjusted her cardigan, which bore the faint scent of lavender and overuse. "Not today, no. Not yesterday either, come to think of it. Though I did hear her front gate very early yesterday morning, before dawn. I assumed she was off to her allotment. She's mad for that rhubarb, you know." "Yes," Purbright murmured. "So I've been told." "She didn't come home last night," Mrs. Barling went on, as though reporting on a neighbor's laundry habits. "Not that I watched, of course. I only noticed because her kitchen light never came on. She always boils an egg at 6:30. "Does she, indeed?" Purbright said, storing the detail gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Barling." She looked faintly disappointed at the dismissal, but retreated indoors all the same. Purbright stepped back from the house. "Constable Harrowby, please contact Mr. Wockless and ask whether Mrs. Skilby mentioned traveling anywhere." Harrowby scribbled in a notebook with more determination than accuracy. "Yes, sir." And afterward, "Call the milkman. See when these bottles were last intended for collection." As the constable trotted away, Purbright regarded the silent cottage. The missing shed was odd, but the missing woman, if such she was, felt altogether heavier. He walked slowly toward the end of the lane, letting his thoughts drift without rushing them. Flaxborough seldom presented crimes of grandeur or elaborate schemes. Instead, its misdeeds were as practical and modest as the town itself. When trouble occurred, it tended to sprout from human irritations, old grudges, quiet rivalries, the small cruelties of everyday life. It was entirely possible that Mrs. Skilby had left town for reasons unannounced, Yet he had noticed something at the allotments earlier. Her rhubarb patch, trampled. Not heavily, just enough to suggest someone had walked without care. He considered this gently, the way one might consider an unexpected draught in a closed room, not alarming, but undeniable. By the time he returned to the station, Sergeant Malley was waiting with a sheet of paper and an expression of self-importance usually reserved for council officials, unveiling new parking restrictions. "Sir," Malley said, "we've received another call from Mr. Peveril of the Market Road Post Office." Purbright accepted the paper. "What is it now?" "Mr. Peveril reports that one of his delivery trolleys is missing." "A trolley," Purbright repeated, as though tasting the word. "Yes, sir. Vanished overnight, wheels and all." The inspector gazed at the sergeant without comment. A shed, a woman, now a trolley. Each disappearance insignificant alone, but taken together, forming a quiet sequence that tugged lightly at the imagination. "Did Mr. Peveril say where the trolley was last seen?" "In his backyard, sir, behind the post office." Purbright placed the paper neatly on his desk. "Very well. These matters may be unrelated, but we should not assume so. Malley, ask Mr. Peveril to come in, and put word around discreetly that we are gathering information on last night's goings-on." Malley brightened. "Yes, sir." As he left, Purbright leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his waistcoat. To an outside observer, he might have looked merely contemplative, but behind his mild gaze something stirred. An emerging pattern, faint as a chalk mark in the rain, but present all the same. 2 vanishings might be coincidence. 3 spoke of intention, and Flaxborough, for all its outward modesty, had never been short of intentions. The arrival of Mr. Peveril, when it came, was heralded by the muffled rattle of the post office's ancient bicycle chain, which had survived 5 pensioners, 3 renovations, and 1 regrettable experiment with parcel drones. He entered the station with the air of a man bearing a national emergency, rather than the loss of a postal trolley. "Inspector," he began, removing his cap reverently, "I don't like to bother you, but it's the only trolley I trust. The wheels are oil proper. Can't get that quality nowadays." Purbright offered a sympathetic nod. "I take it the trolley was securely stored?" "In the yard, sir, behind the bins. Locked gate. It's never wandered." "And when did you last see it?" "Last night before closing. I gave it a wipe-down, routine, and put it away." Purbright invited him to sit, though Peveril remained standing as if seeking moral height. "Mr. Peveril, did anything else appear out of place? Footprints? A disturbed bin?" Peveril considered. A paper sack toppled over. Thought it was the wind. But now, his voice strained under the weight of possibility. "We shall make inquiries," Purbright said gently. "For now, try not to assume the worst. A trolley is far easier to misappropriate than a shed." This remark, intended lightly, had the opposite effect. Peveril paled. "It's connected, then, all this vanishing?" Purbright avoided the instinct to reassure with falsehood. "I'm gathering information," he said mildly. "That is all." After the postmaster left, Sergeant Malley re-entered with fresh notes. "Sir, the milkman says he delivered to Mrs. Skilby's yesterday at 5:40. He noticed the bottles from the day before were still there." "So she had not taken them in?" "No, sir, and he says she always does, rain or shine." Purbright rose, walking toward the window, where the afternoon light had softened into a grey that made Flaxborough look faintly apologetic for existing. "When a person vanishes," he said, as much to himself as to Malley, "we look at last habits. What they did routinely, what they did only once. Mrs. Skilby was a woman of routines." "Yes, sir. Egg at 6:30. Purbright's lips twitched. "Quite." He paused, considering the rhythm of events. A shed taken whole, a woman absent, a trolley gone. It was not the items themselves that mattered so much as the method. Quiet, unobserved removal. Someone in Flaxborough was very determined, or very patient. "What of her allotment plot?" Purbright asked. "Have we a record of anything she kept there of value?" Mally consulted a sheet. "Usual tools, sir. Spade, hoe, forks. A small metal tin for seeds. Nothing worth stealing unless you're fond of rutabaga fertilizer." Yet the shed that vanished had belonged to Mrs. Trotspole, her late neighbour at the allotments. That was what caught at Purbright's thoughts. Two elderly women, tending plots side by side for years, now entwined by circumstance in their absence. "Sergeant," Purbright said quietly, "ask Constable Harrowby to gather a short list of Mrs. Skilby's known associates, anyone she might have quarrelled with, depended on, or borrowed from." Mally blinked. "Borrowed, sir? She didn't strike me as the sort." "Even the least sentimental of us?" Purbright replied. "Rely on others more than we realize." He returned to his desk, settling down just as the telephone rang. Mally answered, then covered the receiver. "It's Mr. Wockless again, sir." Purbright sighed inwardly. "Put him through." The constable handed over the receiver. Wockless's voice twitched with self-importance and dread. "Inspector, I thought you ought to know. Mrs. Skilby's plot looks different." "Different how, Mr. Wockless?" "A footprint, sir, in her rhubarb muck, a large footprint. Definitely not hers. She had delicate feet." Purbright allowed a pause. "Large enough that you feel it significant?" "Positively alarming, sir." "And you did not make the print yourself?" Offence crackled down the line. "Certainly not. I would never trample another person's crop, except by accident or emergency." "Thank you, Mr. Wockless. I will visit shortly." Replacing the receiver, Purbright looked at Mally. "Sergeant, we shall take a brief walk." 10 minutes later, Inspector and Sergeant were making their way back to the allotments. The evening was cooling, though pockets of warmth clung stubbornly to the soil. Several gardeners paused mid-weeding to observe the officers, their expressions a mixture of nosiness and civic duty. Wockless hovered near Mrs. Skilby's vacant plot, waving with the enthusiasm of a man convinced of his usefulness. "There," he said triumphantly, pointing. Purbright crouched over the patch of disturbed earth. A single footprint indeed, large, deep, with the outline of a heavy-soled boot. Recent, perhaps within 24 hours, though the soil was not especially damp. "Not one of ours?" Mally asked. "No. Police boots leave a distinct pattern." Purbright examined the surrounding area. "No matching prints leaving the plot." Wockless beamed. "Proof, Inspector." "Proof of a visitor," Purbright corrected calmly. "Nothing more." He continued along the row, pausing at the site where Mrs. Trotspole's shed had once stood. A few wood chips remained, scattered like crumbs marking the path of a departing mouse. "Odd," Purbright murmured. "What is, sir?" Mally asked. "The absence of disturbance. Removing a shed should make an impression. Scratched earth, uneven dragging. But this is clean." "Perhaps they lifted it." "Perhaps." Purbright stood. "But even so, there would be traces. Shed bottoms are seldom kind to grass." As they walked back, the inspector took in the allotments anew, the self-righteous rows of beans, the gossiping clusters of gardeners, the hush that fell when he passed. Flaxborough was changing its breathing. Purbright could sense it. Back at the station, as he hung his coat, Constable Harrowby emerged holding a sheet. "Sir, I spoke to several people who knew Mrs. Skilby. There's something odd." "Go on." "She had a disagreement last week with Mr. Gorley from number 12. Loud one, according to neighbours." Purbright considered. "Over what?" "A parcel delivered to the wrong address. She accused him of keeping it." "What sort of parcel?" "Seeds, apparently. Special ones. From a catalogue." "Ah." Purbright nodded slowly. "Gardening disputes run deeper than most wars." Harrowby swallowed. There's more, sir. She accused him publicly, at the allotments, called him a soil thief. Purbright sighed. The phrase had a certain tragic poetry, even by Flaxborough standards. Well, he said, Mr. Gourley may know more than he intended. We must speak to him tomorrow. The station grew quiet as evening settled. But Purbright, instead of retiring, sat for a long while, gazing thoughtfully at the small stack of notes before him. A shed taken without trace, a woman missing before dawn, a trolley removed unseen, a quarrel over seeds. Small things, each. And yet Flaxborough's smallest things had a habit of swelling, like yeast in neglected dough. Purbright rubbed his temple gently. Somewhere among these quiet disturbances, a single intention waited to be uncovered, and he felt, with the soft certainty of instinct, that the night would not pass without new developments. Inspector Purbright was not given to premonition, and so he regarded his feeling that something more was coming with faint suspicion. It loitered at the back of his mind as he went to bed, just strong enough to make him glance at the telephone on the hall table. It was just after 5 in the morning, when the sky was a pale grey, that the instrument jerked itself awake and rang with a shrillness out of proportion to its size. Purbright, already awake and contemplating the ceiling, answered on the second ring. Inspector Purbright. Sir, Malley here. Sorry to disturb you. We've had a report. From the river. The river, Purbright repeated. Is it overflowing, changing direction, or misbehaving near the bank? Body in it, sir. Malley's voice was tauter than usual. Near the old footbridge. Gentleman walking his dog spotted something caught against the reeds. Purbright sat up. The air of unhurried speculation fell away like a coat taken off its hook. I see. Has anyone been down yet? Constable Harrowby and Dr. Glendinning, sir. They're there now. I thought you'd want to— Yes, Sergeant. I'll come at once. By the time Purbright arrived, a police car and an ambulance stood on the muddy verge near the footbridge. 2 figures waited by the water's edge. The dog walker lingered at a distance with his animal. Dr. Glendinning greeted Purbright with the air of a man whose breakfast had been curtailed. Morning, Inspector. Grim business. Female. Late 60s, I'd say. In the water some hours, but not long enough to alter the features. Purbright stepped carefully down the bank. The body lay on a tarpaulin, drawn clear of the river. The woman's face, pale and slackened by death, was not entirely unfamiliar. Mrs. Skilby, he said quietly. Harrowby nodded. Yes, sir. Identified by the neighbour, Mrs. Barling. Took one look and burst into tears, said she knew something awful had happened because the kitchen light never came on. Glendinning crouched, examining the clothing. Fully dressed. House shoes, not gardening ones. No obvious blow to the head. I'd say drowning, but will confirm later. There are faint bruises on the left wrist, as if gripped. Hard to be sure. Could she have slipped? Harrowby asked. People do slip, Glendinning replied, but they usually try very hard not to. When they fall, they tend to look scraped. Purbright's gaze travelled to the water. Upstream lay the allotments, and between them and the river ran a path used by dog walkers and short-cutting clerks. Where exactly was she found? He asked. Harrowby pointed to a clump of reeds. Caught there, sir. Current's weak. She can't have come far. Any sign of disturbance nearby? Footprints on the towpath, but that's normal, Harrowby said. Glendinning straightened. I'll have her taken to the mortuary. You'll get my preliminary report this afternoon. Thank you, Doctor, Purbright said. And do note those bruises. Sir, Harrowby ventured as they walked back. Do you think she did it herself? Walked out before dawn, Purbright said mildly. Wearing house shoes to drown herself in a chilly river? Point taken, sir, Harrowby muttered. Suicide, Purbright went on, is very seldom tidy. When it appears tidy, I become suspicious. They reached the station. Inside, Sergeant Malley had already drawn a line on the incident board. connecting missing person Mrs. Skilby with body recovered, female, unidentified. "It is Mrs. Skilby," the inspector said. "We will treat her death as suspicious until given good reason not to." "In the shed, sir? In the trolley?" Malley asked. "Those," Purbright replied, hanging up his coat. "We shall treat as though they are trying to tell us something. We must listen carefully." He set the constables to house inquiries, collecting small facts. When people had last seen Mrs. Skilby and whether she had seemed angry, anxious, or cheerful. By mid-morning that morning, a sketch of her final day had emerged. She had been seen arguing with Mr. Gourley outside the post office at 9. She had collected a packet, contents unknown, from the counter. She had then stopped at the grocer's for eggs, refused to pay the extra penny for premium browns, and gone home. After that, the town's memory grew hazy. It was Malley who brought in the first sharper sliver. "Sir," he said, "the post office clerk remembers the parcel she collected. Said it was light, long, and rattled. Wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. Catalogue label." "From the seed company, most likely," Purbright said. "Yes, sir. And there's more. The clerk overheard her say to Mr. Gourley, 'You'll not cheat me twice.'" Purbright leaned back slightly. "Twice. That suggests history." "Yes, sir. And Mr. Gourley didn't deny it. He just said, 'You can't prove a thing, woman,' and walked off." "A charming fellow," Purbright murmured. "We shall renew our acquaintance with him this afternoon." He stood, glancing once more at the board, where 3 notes hung in a neat vertical. Shed, trolley, body. "Meanwhile, Sergeant," he added, "I want a constable to walk the path from Mrs. Skilby's house to the river, then along by the allotments, looking for anything that does not fit. A dropped object or a broken stem. Small things will have to work hard for us today, every step taken." As Malley hurried away, the inspector studied the notes again. None of them spoke yet, but together they were beginning, faintly, to clear their throats. Constable Harrowby's search along the path yielded little more than a discarded crisp packet and a single sock of indeterminate ownership, neither of which struck Purbright as significant unless Flaxborough had suddenly become host to a particularly absent-minded vagrant. Still, Harrowby reported his findings with earnest thoroughness, and Purbright listened with the same patience he afforded most sincere but unhelpful contributions. The inspector's attention, however, was fixed on a different thread. Shortly after noon, Sergeant Malley informed him that Mr. Gourley had arrived at the station. Voluntarily, in the sense that Malley had gone to fetch him, and used the word preferable several times in close succession. Purbright found Gourley waiting in the interview room, a narrow-shouldered man with a pinched expression. His coat was too large for him, giving the impression that he had borrowed it from someone who ate considerably more and worried considerably less. "Mr. Gourley," Purbright began pleasantly as he took a seat opposite him, "thank you for coming in." Gourley sniffed. "Didn't have much choice, did I? That sergeant of yours made it sound like I'd be dragged here otherwise." "Clarification," Purbright said mildly, "is rarely harmful. We wanted to ask about your last interactions with Mrs. Skilby." Gourley shifted. "I told you people already. She accused me of stealing something, completely unfounded." "Seeds, I understand." "Seeds?" Gourley scoffed, though he looked uncomfortable. "Half the town orders seeds in spring. The postman muddled a delivery, that's all. She got hers back." Purbright tilted his head. "But she seemed to believe you had taken something from her more recently." "Well, she was wrong." He folded his arms tightly. "She said I'd interfered with another parcel. I hadn't even seen the thing." Purbright observed him a moment. "Mr. Gourley, did you quarrel with Mrs. Skilby on the morning before she disappeared?" "I didn't quarrel," Gourley insisted. "She did. Said I was a common pilferer and a menace to horticulture. Over the top, if you ask me." I see. Purbright's voice carried neither condemnation nor sympathy. And where were you yesterday evening, between 6 and 9? At home, Gourley said quickly. Reading. Ask my landlady. We shall. Purbright stood. For now, that will do. Please remain available should we need to speak again. Gourley nodded but avoided the inspector's eye as he left. The moment the door closed, Purbright exhaled quietly, not in relief but in thought. Mally re-entered. What do you make of him, sir? He lies extremely poorly, Purbright answered. An encouraging trait in suspects, but unfortunately also common in those who are merely defensive. Do you think he killed her? Not yet, Purbright said, but his temper is noteworthy. He crossed back to his desk, where the telephone began to ring once more. Mally answered, then blinked. It's Mr. Peveril again, sir. Purbright raised a brow. Has the trolley reappeared? No, sir, but he says he remembered something. From yesterday. Purbright sighed inwardly, but gestured to put the call through. The postmaster's voice came over the line, breathy and excited. Inspector, I don't know if it matters. Well, it probably doesn't. But I thought I should mention it. Go ahead, Mr. Peveril. It's about Mrs. Skilby. After she collected her parcel yesterday morning, she stopped outside my shop and shook it. Shook it? Yes, violently. Then she opened it on the step. I could see little white packets inside, like seed sachets. She looked furious. What did she do next? She put the parcel under her arm and marched off. Didn't say a word, but she looked disappointed somehow. Disappointed? Yes, as though what she'd received wasn't what she expected. Purbright thanked him and hung up. He paced a short distance, hands clasped behind his back. Sergeant, he said slowly, I would like you to contact the Seed Catalog Company. Find out precisely what Mrs. Skilby ordered and whether anyone else in town placed an identical order. Mally sputtered. Sir, half the gardeners will have ordered something. Precisely, Purbright said. We shall have to be thorough. Begin with the last fortnight. While Mally telephoned, Constable Harrowby returned with news from the river path. Found nothing unusual, sir, except a slight scuff on the embankment near where she was pulled out. Could have been anything. Purbright nodded. A scuff is better than nothing. Make a note of its position and ask around whether anyone heard voices near the river early yesterday morning. Harrowby saluted and departed again. A few minutes later, Mally approached with a puzzled expression. Sir, the catalogue company says Mrs. Skilby ordered 3 items, a special rhubarb variant, a packet of climbing beans, and a small sachet of experimental fertilizer. But they also say, go on, Sergeant. They also say that another customer in Flaxborough ordered the exact same 3 items. Paid cash. Collected from the post office the day before Mrs. Skilby's parcel arrived. Purbright turned slowly. Who was the other customer? Mally looked down at his notes. Mr. Gourley, sir. The inspector went still for a moment. Not tense, just very, very still. Then he resumed his quiet pacing. That, he said, is interesting. He must have stolen her parcel, Mally said. Twice. Perhaps, Purbright murmured. But I'm more interested in why someone would want 2 identical orders. Seeds are not rare jewels. Rhubarb is not priceless contraband. But maybe he wanted the fertilizer? Possibly, Purbright said, but we should resist the temptation to assume that inconvenience equals guilt. Still, he could not ignore the growing shape behind these small events. Mrs. Skilby had ordered something she badly wanted. Gourley had ordered the same. One parcel had disappointed her. One parcel had vanished, and at the center of this modest web stood 2 allotments, one empty of its shed, the other ownerless by consequence of its occupant's death. Late that afternoon, Dr. Glendinning telephoned with a preliminary report. Cause of death? Drowning. But those bruises on the wrist? Distinct grip marks. Fairly fresh. Purbright listened carefully. So someone may have held her? Possibly, or tried to pull her from the water. Hard to tell. And the time of death? Between 4 and 6 in the morning, judging by temperature and condition. Purbright thanked him, replaced the receiver, and remained seated a long moment, the patterns in his mind becoming clearer. Not yet enough for certainty, but enough for direction. Someone had met Mrs. Skilby before dawn. Someone she either trusted enough to approach, or confronted willingly. Something had passed between them, something connected to seeds, parcels, and a shed that vanished too neatly. As evening deepened, Purbright stepped outside the station. The air smelled faintly of river reeds and damp soil. Flaxborough seemed quiet, but the quiet was watchful. The next step, he knew, would have to be taken with care, for the truth was no longer hiding in objects, it was hiding in people. The twilight that evening settled over Flaxborough without haste, as though the town needed gentle preparation for whatever Purbright might uncover next. The inspector remained on foot, strolling thoughtfully past the shuttered shops and the dimming windows of the high street. He walked not because he expected revelations to leap from hedgerows, but because movement helped the shape of things settle in his mind. Mrs. Skilby had died before the sun rose, and she had died wearing house shoes. It was the house shoes that returned to him repeatedly. One may take the river path in stout gardening boots, but only purpose or coercion would draw a woman from her cottage in such gentle footwear at that hour. As he passed the post office, he paused beneath its dim exterior lamp. Mr. Peveril was inside, closing the cash drawer with exaggerated care. The postmaster spotted the inspector through the window and hurried out. "Inspector, I didn't mean to bother you again, but I've remembered something else." "Might not matter." Purbright nodded, as though expecting just such a development. "Do tell me." Peveril lowered his voice, even though the street was empty. "Yesterday morning, before Mrs. Skilby collected her parcel, I saw her speaking with someone outside. Very hush-hush. Couldn't hear a word, of course." "Who was she speaking with?" "Mr. Laker. You know, the carpenter who mends the allotment fencing now and then." Purbright regarded him with mild interest. "Mr. Laker. Did their conversation seem heated?" No, nothing like that. Quite the opposite. She looked, well, almost excited. He handed her something. Small. Could have been a key." Purbright thanked him and continued on, his steps now directed by this new, faintly glinting thread. Laker. A carpenter. A man accustomed to sheds, and someone who might easily lift one without leaving so much as a scratch on the allotment grass. The following morning, Purbright paid a visit to the carpenter's workshop at the north end of town. The place smelled of varnish and patience. Inside, Mr. Laker was planing a plank of oak, his movements steady and precise. "Morning, Inspector," he said, glancing up without stopping the rhythm of the plane. "You're here early. Council want another bench repaired?" "Not today," Purbright replied. "I simply wish to ask you about Mrs. Skilby." Laker's hands faltered just a fraction. "Oh? Sad business, that." "Yes," Purbright said. "Mr. Peveril mentioned seeing you speak with her the morning before she disappeared." Laker set down the tool. "Nothing serious. She asked if I could help reinforce her shed door. Said she'd had trouble with foxes." "Foxes," Purbright repeated mildly. "That's what she claimed. Wanted a new lock fitted. I told her I'd look in later in the week." "And did she show you anything?" Laker hesitated. "Well, yes. She had a key she wanted copied. Said it belonged to a small lockbox. Didn't bring the box, though. Only the key." Purbright's expression remained politely neutral. "And where is that key now?" "In a drawer. Never got round to it." He wiped his hands on a cloth and crossed to a workbench. After rummaging, he produced a small, lightly worn key. Purbright studied it, turning it gently between his fingers. Did she say what the lockbox contained? No, seemed private about it, but she was very particular. Wanted the copy done before the weekend. Curious, Purbright murmured. Mrs. Skilby was not a woman who relied much on others. So I gathered, Laker said with a faint smile. Purbright returned the key. Thank you for your help, Mr. Laker. Please keep yourself available. We may need to speak again. He left the workshop and began walking toward the allotments. A lockbox, a copy of a key, and seeds that had disappointed her. Something she expected had not arrived. Something she urgently wished to secure. At the allotments, the morning regulars were already about. Mr. Wassiter spotted the inspector immediately, his natural gift for pessimism allowing him to sense the slightest whiff of official concern. "Inspector, I've been thinking," he said, bustling over. Mrs. Skilby stored things in her shed. "I saw her once hiding a tin under a loose board." Purbright stopped. "A tin?" "Yes, painted green, about this size." He demonstrated with excessive enthusiasm. "Could that be relevant?" "Possibly," Purbright replied, "though Mrs. Skilby's shed remains where it always was. It has not disappeared." "Oh," Wassiter said, slightly deflated. "Yes, hers is still here. It's Mrs. Trotspole's that—" He froze. Purbright turned. "Mr. Wassiter, I may have told you something inaccurate about the missing shed. You made several statements, Mr. Wassiter. Which particular inaccuracy troubles you?" Wassiter swallowed. "I said no one came to the allotments that night, but this morning Mrs. Hargill says she heard a van. Very late. Thought it was her boiler." Purbright exhaled softly. "A van?" "Yes, Inspector, and she said she saw someone carrying something, long and narrow, could have been planks. Or," Purbright said gently, "the disassembled panels of a shed." Wassiter nodded with the grim satisfaction of a man who'd rather be right and distressed than wrong and comfortable. Purbright thanked him, then moved down the path to Mrs. Trotspole's emptied plot. He stood, very still, letting the quiet of the allotment settle around him. A van, a lockbox key, identical parcels, and a dead woman who had expected something quite different than what she received. He leaned down and pressed his fingers against the soil. Calmly lifting them, he inspected a thin smear of grayish residue across his fingertip. Not soil, not compost, something finer. A powder. He rubbed it between finger and thumb. Slightly gritty. Sharp-smelling. Fertilizer. Not a common agricultural sort either. This had a chemical note often associated with experimental blends. Mrs. Skilby had been determined to obtain the fertilizer she had ordered. So determined that she confronted Gourley. So determined she tried to duplicate the key to a lockbox in which, perhaps, she meant to keep it. But if the fertilizer in her parcel was not what she expected, then where was the correct sachet? A van. A missing shed. A lockbox. Someone had taken something from Mrs. Skilby, or planned to, and she had gone out in her house shoes to confront them. Purbright stood, brushing his hands clean. A small thing, just a thin dusting of powder, yet it hummed with significance. It was time, he decided, to examine Mrs. Skilby's cottage more thoroughly. For a woman who had died, disappointed, angry, and secretly preparing a second key may very well have left behind the one clue that tied every quiet disappearance together. Mrs. Skilby's cottage, when Purbright reached it, seemed even smaller than he remembered. Its close-drawn curtains made the house appear to be holding its breath. Constable Harrowby waited outside, looking both dutiful and faintly unnerved, as though expecting the cottage itself might object to being entered. "I've not touched anything, sir," Harrowby said quickly. "Doors still locked. Curtains as before." "Good," Purbright replied, producing the key supplied by Mrs. Barling. "Let's see what Mrs. Skilby wished so much to protect." The lock turned with a reluctant click, and Purbright pushed the door inward. A faint smell, Lavender polish, dust, and something slightly metallic drifted out. The inspector stepped inside, allowing his eyes to adjust. The hallway was narrow and practical, the kind of space that served more as a conduit than a room. "Lights, Constable," Purbright said softly. Harrowby switched them on. The cottage revealed itself in stages. A tidy sitting room with knitted antimacassars on every surface, a small kitchen where the egg pan still sat drying upside down, and a hallway table whose lace runner did its best to appear decorative despite having been knitted in a moment of haste long ago. Purbright began in the sitting room. "We are looking, Constable, for something that would justify a copied key. A lockbox, possibly small." Harrowby immediately began scanning shelves with the intensity of a man seeking a lost wallet rather than a clue to a murder. Purbright, meanwhile, inspected a small cabinet beside the armchair. Inside were the usual artifacts of elderly independence: insurance letters, spectacle cases, a half-used tin of barley sweets. But nothing requiring a key. The inspector moved next to the kitchen. He opened drawers, cupboards, and even the small pantry, but all he found were the well-organized remains of Mrs. Skilby's habitual routines. Labeled jars, carefully folded cloths, tins arranged by expiration date. Harrowby appeared in the doorway. "Sir, nothing upstairs but clothes and a rather stern-looking portrait of her husband." "Look again for anything set apart," Purbright said gently. "People who guard valuables often conceal them in places that seem too personal to search." Harrowby nodded and trotted off. Purbright's gaze drifted to the floor. A faint scuff in the linoleum caught his eye. Just a small crescent-shaped mark, as though something heavy had been moved recently. He crouched, following the arc of the mark to a corner beneath the window. There stood a small sideboard, sturdy, plain, and, when he touched it, far heavier than it looked. He leaned against it, shifting it several inches. Dust released itself in a grey sigh, and behind the sideboard something glinted faintly. "Aha," Purbright murmured. He reached behind and retrieved a small metal box, brass and well-worn, with a simple keyhole. It looked unassuming enough, yet the weight of it, and the fact that it had been hidden behind heavy furniture, spoke volumes. "Constable," Purbright called. Harrowby rushed down the stairs, boots thumping. "Sir, did you find it?" Purbright held up the box. "I suspect this is what Mrs. Skilby wished to secure." Harrowby leaned forward eagerly. "Shall I fetch Mr. Laker's key?" "That won't be necessary," Purbright said. "This box, I suspect, uses the original key Mrs. Skilby kept." He pulled a small ring from his pocket. Mrs. Barling had included it among the items she believed belonged to the deceased. One of the keys was ordinary, another was smaller, more delicate. Purbright inserted it into the lockbox. It turned smoothly. Inside were 3 items. The first was a folded piece of notepaper, yellowing around the edges. The second was a small cloth bag tied neatly with string. The third was a tiny glass vial, half filled with fine grey powder. Purbright unfolded the note with careful fingers. A single line, written in a stern, spidery hand, read, "Not for sale, not for sharing, not for fools." Harrowby blinked. "What does that mean, sir?" Purbright did not answer immediately. He opened the cloth bag. Inside were seeds, small, uniform, and unfamiliar. He held one up to the light. "These," he said quietly, "are not common garden seeds." "Well, what are they?" Purbright examined the vial next. The grey powder inside matched the residue he found near the site of the missing shed. "Experimental fertilizer," he murmured. "But not the sort a catalogue company would sell lightly." Harrowby frowned. "So she ordered something special?" "More than special," Purbright said. "Something rare. Something valuable to the right or wrong person." He closed the box gently and replaced everything as it had been. "What now, sir?" Harrowby asked. We find out who else knew she possessed this. Purbright glanced around the small, silent cottage, and why someone believed it important enough to confront her before dawn. They returned to the station just as Sergeant Malley was preparing a pot of tea strong enough to remove varnish. "Any progress, sir?" he asked, handing Purbright a cup. "Yes," Purbright said. Mrs. Skilby was guarding something unusual, possibly dangerous, the sort of thing that might incite rivalry, theft, or worse. Harrowby added, beaming at his contribution, "We found a box, a secret one." "Indeed," Purbright said, "and inside it, evidence of something more deliberate than mere gardening mishaps." Malley frowned thoughtfully. "So the shed, the trolley, even her parcel, all connected?" "Almost certainly," Purbright replied. He set his tea aside, stood before the incident board, and with a piece of chalk drew a line linking shed, trolley, parcel, Skilby. "And now," Purbright said quietly, "we ask who in Flaxborough desires something hidden inside a brass box enough to commit a string of quiet thefts, and to meet with a woman at the river before first light." Malley swallowed. "Shall we bring Gourley back in?" "In due course," Purbright said. "But for now, we require clarity more than confrontation." "But who else knew about the lockbox?" Harrowby asked. Purbright was already answering the question in his own mind. Not aloud, not yet. Instead, he lifted his coat from the stand. "Sergeant," he said, "have Constable Harrowby look into Mr. Laker's recent work requests. Any sheds repaired, locks changed, or structures moved in the past week." "And you, sir?" Malley asked. Purbright opened the station door, letting the cool air wash over him. "I," he said, "am going to speak with someone who knew Mrs. Skilby better than she admitted." He paused. "Mrs. Trotspole's nephew." Finding Mrs. Trotspole's nephew proved surprisingly easy. Flaxborough, being a town that kept better track of genealogies than rainfall, had already well catalogued him. Mr. Edwin Trotspole, age 35, clerk at the municipal offices, polite in a fragile, papery sort of way, and known mostly for wearing sweaters that seemed knitted in apology. Purbright located him at his desk in the town records department. Edwin was carefully writing something in his narrow, precise hand, though the inspector suspected the man's primary occupation was looking busy rather than being so. When he looked up and saw Purbright, his expression passed through several stages: surprise, worry, and, finally, the resigned politeness of a man accustomed to receiving official correspondence but never expecting to generate it. "Inspector Purbright," Edwin said faintly, "is something wrong? Has there been, well, something?" "Yes," Purbright replied calmly, "but nothing about you personally. I wish to speak regarding your late aunt, Mrs. Trotspole." "Oh." Edwin deflated with relief, then immediately re-inflated with guilt. "I mean, yes, of course. Terrible loss. I miss her terribly." "Every day?" He paused. "Well, every few days." Purbright took the vacant chair opposite him. "Mr. Trotspole, were you aware that your aunt's shed at the allotments has disappeared?" Edwin blinked. "Disappeared?" The words seemed too theatrical for him, and he tried again. "Gone?" "Gone entirely." He looked baffled. "But why would someone steal a shed?" "That is one of several questions at hand." Purbright regarded him gently. "Your aunt kept anything of value in it?" "Oh, no," Edwin said quickly. "She was very tidy about her things. Tools always in the same place, seeds in alphabetical order. And no lockbox or private papers stored there?" "Good heavens, no." Edwin shook his head with such earnest conviction it was hard to believe he had ever lied successfully in his life. She kept her important things at home, in a biscuit tin under the bed. Exactly where burglars would look, but she said that was the point. They'd never believe she was that straightforward. Purbright allowed himself a small smile before returning to purpose. "And did she know Mrs. Skilby well?" "Oh, yes. Messrs. Trotspole and Skilby were rivals for years. Friendly rivals, mind you. Competed in best rhubarb every spring. Aunt Mildred won the last 2 years. She was very proud of that. Any quarrels? Edwin hesitated, his fingers curling around the edge of the desk. Not quarrels exactly, but there was an incident last summer. Go on. Well, Edwin said, lowering his voice as though the filing cabinets might be eavesdropping, Aunt Mildred accused Mrs. Skilby of spying on her compost recipe, said she spotted Mrs. Skilby leaning over the fence with a notebook. Mrs. Skilby claimed she was merely sketching a pigeon. Was this resolved peacefully? In the Flaxborough sense, Edwin said, meaning they ignored each other politely for 3 months and then pretended it was all terribly silly. Purbright nodded slowly. Mr. Trotspole, do you know of anything at all, that might have made your aunt's shed valuable to someone? More than sentiment? Edwin shook his head firmly. No, Inspector. Aunt Mildred was practical. Nothing mysterious about her. Purbright thanked him and stood. Edwin, still pale, watched him leave as though hoping he would not return with further questions. The inspector walked back toward the station in a thoughtful silence. Edwin had seemed honest enough, but the mention of rivalry, friendly or otherwise, was not insignificant. 2 women, each guarding their rhubarb secrets as jealously as ancient alchemists. It was possible, just possible, that one had come into possession of something the other wanted. When Purbright stepped inside the station, Sergeant Malley was waiting with a sheaf of notes and the air of a man who had discovered a minor revelation. Sir, I've checked Mr. Laker's recent work, and there's something odd. Purbright removed his coat. Go on. 2 days before the shed disappeared, Laker was hired to reinforce a garden outbuilding, not at the allotments, at a private residence. The customer paid cash and refused a receipt. Name? Didn't give one, Malley said. But Laker wrote down the address. Number 14 Millview Road, belongs to a Mr. Jesmond, retired. Purbright raised a brow. Jesmond was known for having an opinion about everything and a purpose for nothing. Why would Mr. Jesmond require reinforcement, and why keep his name quiet? That was my question, sir. Purbright considered. A reinforced outbuilding, a missing shed, fertilizer of uncertain origin, and a woman who had intended to lock something away in a brass box. Was the job large? He asked. No, sir. Laker said it was peculiar. The outbuilding was barely 7 feet square, but the customer insisted on extra bracing along the bottom panels. Paid over the odds. Purbright let the information settle in his mind. Hidden structures. Reinforced panels. Something long and narrow carried under cover of night. He reached for his hat again. Sergeant, fetch Harrowby. We're going to Millview Road. A short walk later, the inspector and his constables approached the neat, semi-detached property. Mr. Jesmond answered the door, wearing a dressing gown patterned with small pheasants and an expression that suggested he was suspicious of all daylight callers. Inspector, what's all this? Simply routine inquiries, Mr. Jesmond, Purbright said calmly. May we come in? Jesmond hesitated but stepped back. His sitting room smelled faintly of pipe smoke and boiled vegetables. Purbright's gaze drifted from the cluttered mantelpiece to a framed photograph of Jesmond shaking hands with someone who appeared deeply uninterested in the handshake. I understand, Purbright began, that you recently commissioned work on an outbuilding. Jesmond stiffened. What of it? May we see it? The old man wavered, his lips tightening. No need. It's nothing. Just repairs. Mr. Jesmond, Purbright said gently, we are investigating a suspicious death. Cooperation would be appreciated. The name Death softened Jesmond's resistance instantly. He opened the back door with a trembling hand. They stepped into the small back garden. At the far end stood the outbuilding, square, plain, and newer looking than its surroundings. Purbright approached it slowly. Constable, he said quietly, open it please." Harrowby unlatched the door. It swung inward. Inside was a meticulously swept, empty space. Almost too empty. The floorboards gleamed with recent application of varnish. And along the interior base, bracing beams had been fixed, thick, sturdy, and unnecessary, unless the structure needed to bear weight. Or conceal something heavy. But there was no shed, no tools, nothing more dramatic than the faint odor of linseed oil. Jesmond shuffled awkwardly. "It's just storage. Nothing in it yet." Purbright stepped inside, running his fingertips along the smooth bracing. "Why reinforce an empty shed, Mr. Jesmond?" Jesmond wrung his hands. I thought I might store books in here. Heavy things. Books." Purbright turned to him with quiet gentleness. "Mr. Jesmond, did anyone ask you to store something for them? Something belonging to Mrs. Trotspole? Or Mrs. Skilby?" Jesmond paled. "No one asked me anything." But his eyes flickered, just once, toward the far corner of the shed, where the varnish looked slightly darker, as though recently wiped. Purbright's gaze settled there. Calmly he said, "Mr. Jesmond, what was here?" The silence that followed felt exactly like the moment before someone breaks. Jesmond's mouth opened, closed, and then trembled slightly, as though searching for a lie that might be both convincing and morally tolerable. None presented itself. His shoulders sank. It was only for a night," he blurted. "I didn't mean any harm. Truly I didn't." Purbright waited with patient stillness. Harrowby, by contrast, leaned forward with the eager intensity of someone scenting imminent confession. Jesmond wiped his forehead with a sleeve of pheasants. "A man came 2 nights ago, said he needed a place to put something, just until morning. Said it belonged to a lady who didn't have proper storage. Offered me £1 for the trouble." "£1?" Malley said, scandalized. "For illicit storage?" Jesmond winced. He seemed respectable, well-dressed, and he said it was important not to tell anyone, that it was done for her own protection. "Whose protection?" Purbright asked quietly. I assumed he meant the lady, didn't ask which. He brought the thing late, nearly midnight, backed a van right up to the gate. I didn't see what he unloaded. He told me not to look. "But you did," Purbright said mildly. Jesmond flushed. "Not then, but in the morning. I couldn't help checking." "And what did you see?" Jesmond swallowed. "A shed." Harrowby nearly choked. "A shed, sir. He hid the shed in here." Jesmond held up his hands helplessly. "Not a big one. Smaller than most. It looked old, green paint, a bit battered." "Mrs. Trotspole's shed." Purbright nodded, slowly. "And was it locked?" "Yes, and something rattled inside it. Like metal, or glass. Don't know, I didn't open it, I swear." "And what happened to it?" Purbright asked. Jesmond wrung his hands again. The man returned the next afternoon. Midday, loaded it back into the van. Thanked me, gave me another £1. His voice deflated. "I feel a fool." Purbright glanced around the shed interior once more. No footprints, no debris. But Jesmond's story aligned with Wassiter's delayed revelation. A van. Something long carried through the night. And now, a shed temporarily stored in a reinforced outbuilding. "Did this man tell you his name?" Purbright asked. "No, Inspector. But he said he was doing a favor for a gardening woman, and that she'd be grateful." Harrowby muttered. "Doesn't sound like Mrs. Skilby." "No," Purbright murmured, "but it might sound like someone wishing to gain her trust or deceive her." He thanked Jesmond, who sagged with visible relief as they stepped out into the garden. Once outside, Harrowby turned to Purbright, wide-eyed. "Sir, does this mean the shed thief is the same person who confronted Mrs. Skilby at the river?" "It suggests," Purbright replied, "that the disappearance of Mrs. Trotspole's shed was not motivated by gardening interests." Malley frowned. "Then what was inside it?" Jesmond said something rattled. Purbright began walking back toward the road, hands behind his back. Something valuable enough to move under cover of night, something small enough to store but dangerous enough to hide, and something Mrs. Skilby likely expected inside her parcel. The fertilizer? Harrowby guessed. Or the seeds, Mally added. Or both, Purbright concluded. But whatever it was, someone believed Mrs. Trotspole had possessed it or hidden it in her shed. They walked in silence for a moment before Purbright added, and Mrs. Skilby, seeing her parcel arrive incomplete, may have realized someone else had intercepted the rest. Gourley? Mally asked reflexively. Not necessarily. Mr. Gourley lacks subtlety for nocturnal shed removal. Purbright gave the faintest hint of amusement. No, I suspect someone with practical skill, someone capable of lifting a shed without leaving marks. He did not name Mr. Laker, but the implication hung in the air. Back at the station, Purbright sat, staring at the growing constellation of notes on the board. He added a new card, shed temporarily stored. Unknown man. Mally hovered nearby. Sir, about this unknown man. Jesmond said he seemed respectable. Many criminals do, Purbright replied. It is one of their more tedious traits. Harrowby returned with his notebook open. Sir, I've checked with Mr. Laker's listed customers. He had no jobs scheduled near Mrs. Trotspole's plot recently, but... He paused dramatically. Yes, Constable? He did mention working late 2 nights ago, said he was finishing repairs at the Eastgate Community Garden, but no one there recalls seeing him. Purbright nodded slowly. And does the Eastgate Garden lie on a route suitable for driving unnoticed to Millview Road? It does, sir. And does Mr. Laker own a van? Harrowby grinned triumphantly. Yes, sir. A blue one. Mally swallowed. Sir, this is sounding rather more deliberate. Purbright stood, taking his hat once more. We shall pay Mr. Laker another visit, but gently. We must not alarm him. They crossed town to Laker's workshop. The carpenter was outside, stacking timber. He looked up as they approached, his expression composed, but more guarded than before. Inspector, Laker said. Back so soon? Purbright smiled politely. I'm afraid a few small matters require clarification. Of course. Laker wiped his hands on his apron. What can I help with? You said you did not complete the key copy for Mrs. Skilby. That's right, Laker replied. Didn't have time. And you said you had no unusual work the night before last. Laker stiffened. I said nothing of the sort. I said I'd been busy. Indeed, Purbright said pleasantly. Busy where exactly? Laker hesitated. Various places. Were any of these places, Purbright continued, associated with the transportation of sheds? The carpenter's face changed, not dramatically, not guiltily, but in that subtle way that occurs when someone's internal narrative begins to falter. Inspector, Laker said quietly, I think you are making something out of nothing. Possibly, Purbright replied. But when a woman dies, and her neighbor's shed disappears, and a reinforced building houses something briefly in secret, I become curious. Laker's eyes flickered, once to his workshop door. Harrowby saw it. Mally saw it. Purbright, of course, had seen it first. Is someone inside, Mr. Laker? Purbright asked softly. The carpenter inhaled, long and tense. No. Purbright nodded once, almost sympathetically. Then I think, he said, we should look together. He stepped toward the workshop door. Laker took one involuntary step backwards, small but unmistakably defensive. That was when the faint thud sounded from inside. A thud that did not belong to wood, or tools, or anything that ought to be moving of its own accord. Purbright paused, hand on the latch, and looked at Laker. Mr. Laker, he said in a tone of quiet inevitability, I believe you're about to tell me the truth. For a long, strained moment, Laker did not speak. His throat worked once, twice, and his gaze, usually steady with the quiet confidence of a craftsman, flickered with something between fear and calculation. Purbright waited with that peculiar stillness he used like a soft lantern, not blinding but impossible to ignore. Another thud sounded from inside the workshop, this time closer. Laker shut his eyes briefly, as though something within him had given up pretending. "It's not," he began, then stopped, visibly abandoning whatever lie he had reached for. "It's not what you think." "Excellent," Purbright said pleasantly. "That leaves room for accuracy." Laker exhaled sharply and pushed past him, not to run, but to open the workshop door himself, as if asserting at least the dignity of surrendering on his own terms. The inspector and the constables followed him inside. The thud revealed its source at once. A man, gagged lightly with a strip of cloth, and tied to a chair with rope that had been knotted by someone who understood knots intimately. The man was in his late 50s, heavy-set, balding, and wearing an expression of offense rather than distress. Mally gasped. "Mr. Zebulon Preece." "The agricultural chemist," Harrowby added unnecessarily, "the one who gave the lecture about soil acidity last month." Purbright approached the bound man. "Mr. Preece, good morning, or afternoon, depending on how long you've been confined." Preece attempted a muffled reply that sounded very much like a complaint about professional disrespect. Laker hurried forward, untying the gag. "He wasn't supposed to struggle," Laker muttered. "I told him I'd let him go once things settled." "Things," Purbright repeated mildly. Preece spat out a few strands of cotton and glared at his captor. "This imbecile thinks I'm in danger. I told him repeatedly I'm not. I'm an accredited chemist, Inspector." "Accredited?" Yes, Laker said, as though discussing a minor plumbing leak. "But after what happened to Mrs. Skilby—" Purbright held up a hand. "Gentlemen, one at a time." Laker stepped back, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine, I'll start." Preece muttered, "About time," but subsided under Purbright's warning glance. Laker inhaled. "Inspector, I didn't kill Mrs. Skilby, I swear on my mother's grave." "Not yet accused," Purbright said kindly. "Continue." "I moved the shed because I was hired to." "By whom?" Laker's expression soured. "Mr. Preece here," Mally sputtered. "The chemist hired you to steal a shed." "I did not steal anything," Preece erupted. "I commissioned temporary relocation for inspection purposes." Purbright inclined his head, permitting him to speak. Preece straightened his tie, which was difficult, considering the rope still circled his torso, and spoke with the aggrieved precision of a man correcting a badly written scientific paper. "The fertilizer Mrs. Skilby ordered was experimental, extremely experimental. I developed it myself. She'd been testing samples for me for months, privately. She preferred discretion, said it gave her an advantage at the garden. Competitions." "Was her success due to the fertilizer?" Purbright asked. "It boosted yield," so Preece said modestly, "and occasionally caused minor issues, unexpected bloom colors, accelerated growth, but nothing harmful. However, the formula is, shall we say, not yet approved for distribution." "Not legal," Mally translated. "Pending approval," Preece corrected sharply. Purbright turned back to Laker. "And your role?" Laker sighed. "I delivered some of the earlier samples, just as a favor. Mrs. Skilby trusted me, and when she told me she expected one last batch, she said she wanted it kept somewhere secure until she'd tested it." "And this last batch," Purbright said softly, "was inside Mrs. Trotspole's shed?" Preece grimaced. "I may have arranged to hide it there temporarily. Neutral ground, secure. Mrs. Trotspole had passed on, and the shed was rarely visited. And why not give it to Mrs. Skilby directly?" "Because," Preece said with a flush of discomfort, "she had threatened to tell the allotment committee I'd been giving her unapproved materials unless I produced a superior batch immediately. She was impatient, rather aggressive." "And the parcel she received?" Purbright asked. Dummy stock, Priest muttered. Something benign. She wasn't supposed to notice. She did. So, Purbright summarized, you hid the real badge. Mrs. Skilby came to you, or someone, demanding it. She meets someone at dawn, and she ends up in the river. Laker's face tightened. I swear I didn't meet her. I only moved the shed. I thought the chemicals might be dangerous. And after she died, well, I panicked. I thought Mr. Priest might be next. Priest snorted. Ridiculous. My only danger comes from council funding cuts. Purbright studied the two men. Laker anxious, protective, guilty but not murderous. Priest outraged, intellectually vain, almost theatrically inconvenienced. What time, Purbright asked Priest, did you last see Mrs. Skilby? Evening before she died. She came to my home, very angry. Said she knew the parcel wasn't genuine and demanded the real material. And did you give it to her? Of course not. She wanted the formula, not the sample. The formula is worth, well, considerably more than sheds and trolleys. Purbright turned this over gently in his mind. And how did she take your refusal? Badly, Priest admitted. Stormed off, muttering something about fetching what was hers. I assumed she meant the shed. Or perhaps confronting Mr. Gourley again. The woman was unpredictable. Did she say where she intended to go? Priest hesitated. She said, I know who has it. Harrowby gasped. Sir, she meant the thief. Perhaps, Purbright murmured. Or perhaps she meant someone she trusted. Someone who guided her to believe the shed contained her missing property. Laker glanced at him sharply. It wasn't me. I swear it. No, Purbright said quietly. I don't believe it was. He folded his hands behind his back. One final matter, Mr. Priest. Did you tell anyone besides Mr. Laker that Mrs. Trotspole's shed held your experimental batch? Priest drew himself up with embarrassment. Only one person, but purely in scientific confidence. Purbright waited. Mrs. Skilby's closest gardening friend, Priest said reluctantly. They ran nearly adjacent plots, shared tips, comparisons, occasionally secrets. She seemed harmless. Mally frowned. Who is this friend? Priest swallowed. Mrs. Skilby always called her Dear Emma. Purbright's brows rose slightly. Emma. Skilby. No, Priest said. Emma Trotspole. Even Harrowby grasped the implications first. You mean Mrs. Trotspole wasn't childless? She had a daughter? Priest nodded slowly. Purbright stepped back, the pieces fitting with the calm inevitability of dominoes falling. A daughter. Overlooked. Unmentioned. Lives elsewhere. Visits rarely. A daughter who would know exactly where her mother hid things. Exactly how to remove a shed. Not exactly how to lure Mrs. Skilby out before dawn with the promise of a secret returned. Purbright drew a slow breath. Sergeant, he said quietly, find Emma Trotspole. Before this night ended, he knew the truth would no longer be able to hide. Emma Trotspole was found, as Purbright had quietly predicted, not far from Flaxborough at all. She lived in the small village of Branston Fold, just 5 miles away, in a modest brick bungalow facing an overgrown hedge that suggested she preferred privacy over pruning. Purbright, accompanied by Sergeant Mally, arrived mid-afternoon. Emma answered the door with a calmness that would have been impressive had it not been so carefully manufactured. She was in her early 40s with mild features that gave the initial impression of softness, until one noticed the eyes, sharp and assessing, the kind that measured responses before offering a single one of their own. Inspector Purbright, she said, as though expecting an invitation to tea rather than a police inquiry. I thought you might come. Good afternoon, Miss Trotspole, Purbright returned pleasantly. May we speak inside? She stepped aside. The interior was neat, unassuming, and lacked the personal clutter that marked a long occupancy. A woman passing through but not settling. Once seated, Purbright folded his hands politely. "We've been investigating several unusual events in Flaxborough. Your mother's shed disappearing, Mrs. Skilby's death, the misdirected parcel. Your name has arisen in connection with all three." Emma smiled faintly. "I suppose it might. Flaxborough is a place where names float easily." "Perhaps," Purbright agreed. "But details tend to sink or swim, and yours has surfaced with purpose." Her fingers tightened slightly around her teacup, a gesture so small it would have escaped anyone but him. "I understand you were close to Mrs. Skilby," Purbright went on. "Closer, perhaps, than most realized." Emma inhaled. "I visited her allotment whenever I visited my mother. They were neighbors, competitors, friends in a limited sense." "She trusted you," Purbright said. "Perhaps enough to confide in you, enough to show you something precious." Emma set her cup down. "If you have something to ask, Inspector, please do." Purbright nodded. "Very well. Did Mrs. Skilby contact you the evening before she died?" Her gaze flickered. "She did. And what did she want?" "A simple thing," Emma said softly. "Something she believed my mother had left for her." "The experimental fertilizer?" Purbright asked. Emma's silence was confirmation. "She didn't know," Emma murmured after a moment, "that my mother never stored anything of the sort. But I let her believe it after she accused Mr. Gourley of theft. She was furious, humiliated. She swore the allotment committee would hear of it, but her anger, it wasn't righteous. It was desperate." "Desperate for what?" Purbright asked gently. Emma rose and walked to the small window, looking out at the hedge swaying in the breeze. "Mrs. Skilby wanted to win, not just the spring prize. Everything. She wanted to outshine my mother, to best her. That silly rivalry they had wasn't charming. It consumed her. When she learned she hadn't been given the formula she wanted, she became convinced my mother had taken it from her years ago. But your mother had no involvement with the experiments." "None," Emma said. "She found the whole business tiresome. But when Mrs. Skilby telephoned me saying she knew where the real goods were, I suspected she meant my mother's shed." Purbright waited. "She asked me to meet her before dawn by the river path. Said she didn't want the neighbors seeing her retrieve what she believed was stolen from her. She wanted me there to unlock the shed. She thought I'd kept my mother's keys. I tried to dissuade her. She was insistent." Emma's voice thinned ever so slightly at the edges. "We met by the footbridge. She was wearing those ridiculous little house shoes. She was trembling with excitement. Honestly, trembling." "And then?" Purbright asked softly. Emma turned from the window. Her composure held, but her eyes were dampened by something like weariness rather than guilt. She demanded I give her the fertilizer. I told her, truthfully, that I had nothing. She called me a liar, said I was hiding it, that my mother had hidden it first. She became hysterical. She grabbed my arm and shook me, lost her footing on the wet embankment. "You tried to save her," Purbright said quietly. Emma nodded, the first, unguarded gesture she had made. "She slipped. I reached for her. I caught her wrist. You saw the bruises. But the bank was muddy and she panicked. She pulled me down and I lost my balance. She slid into the water. It all happened so fast. And then she was gone." Harrowby, who had been silent, sighed audibly. Mally looked down. Purbright remained still. "Why didn't you come forward?" he asked, though he knew the answer. Emma sank into the chair opposite him. "Because I believed no one would understand. A fight by the river. An old rivalry. A death. It sounded like a quarrel gone too far, and there was the shed, of course. When I learned it had vanished, I assumed someone connected to Skilby was covering tracks. I was terrified the blame would circle back to me." Purbright nodded slowly. "And the shed? You had no part in moving it?" "None," she said. I learned that part only after the fact. Purbright studied her face. There was no triumph there, no vindication, only the quiet exhaustion of someone who had rehearsed the truth long before speaking it. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Trotspole, your account matches the marks on the bank, the bruises, the lack of struggle on the path. Mrs. Skilby entered the water by mischance, not malice. Your attempt to save her was real, and your fear afterward, understandable, though regrettable." Emma closed her eyes briefly, relief softening her posture. Purbright rose. "You will make a formal statement. After that, the coroner will determine the manner of death. But I believe it will be ruled accidental." She looked up, tears finally gathering. "Inspector, thank you." He offered a slight bow of the head. "Truth, Miss Trotspole, is often less dramatic than rumour, but always more stable." Later, as Purbright returned to the station, the town already buzzed with speculation, but by the week's end, Flaxborough would calm. The shed would be returned. Mr. Priest would retreat into cautious scientific obscurity. Mr. Gorley would complain loudly of mistreatment, and Emma Trotspole, quietly, without the town's scrutiny, would bury the last of her mother's legacy. And Inspector Purbright, after filing his final report, sat once more behind his desk, dipping his pen into an ink bottle that had survived 3 chiefs before him. The town exhaled, the mystery ended, and Flaxborough, dependable as ever, prepared itself for the next small tremor in its polite facade.